The gun was already cocked when Esther Hurst realized she had been used. She stood in the middle of the livery stable in Caldwell, Kansas, the year 1878 pressing down on her like a physical weight, the smell of hay and manure and sweat thick in the hot June air. Her traveling dress was filthy from 3 days on the stage. Her hair had come entirely undone from its pins, and the man she had crossed half a continent to meet was pointing a revolver at the only person she had trusted in this God-forsaken territory. Frederick Cooper did not flinch. He stood with his back to the stable wall, hands raised just enough to show he was not reaching for the Colt at his hip, his jaw set in that particular way she had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks as meaning he was either very calm or very close to the edge of something dangerous. His dark eyes moved once briefly to hers, and what she saw there was not fear. It was guilt. The man holding the gun was Gerald Marsh, and Gerald Marsh was supposed to be her employer. He was supposed to be the man who had placed the advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette, the one she had answered in a moment of desperation 6 weeks ago after the letters stopped coming from her brother, and the boarding house raised its rates, and the dress shop on Walnut Street let her go without severance. The advertisement had promised honest work, a schoolteacher's position, a new beginning on the frontier. It had promised a great many things. What it had not promised, and what she now understood with terrible clarity, was the truth. "Tell her," Frederick said, his voice steady, not a tremor in it. "Tell her what you brought her here for, Gerald. Tell her what the hidden motive was all along, because she deserves to know before you make the choice you're about to make." Marsh's face was red, the color of a man who had been drinking since noon, and the revolver moved between them with the unsteady arc of genuine fury. "You had no right to interfere, Cooper. None. This was business." "She is not business," Frederick said, and something in his tone cracked open just slightly in a way that made Esther's chest do something she did not have time to examine. She had come to the frontier expecting hardship. She had read about it in books, in newspapers, in the breathless letters of women who had preceded her west and come back either changed entirely or not come back at all. She had expected dust and heat and loneliness and possibly snakes. She had expected to be tested. She had expected to be frightened. She had not expected Frederick Cooper, and she had certainly not expected this. 6 weeks earlier, Esther Hurst had been a woman of very modest means and very clear practical purpose. She was 26 years old, which in Cincinnati in 1878 made her, by the unkind mathematics of social expectation, a woman of diminishing prospects. She was not plain, though she had been told she was not especially remarkable either, a description she accepted with the same pragmatic equanimity she applied to most things. She had brown hair that was thick and did what she told it to when the weather cooperated, and gray eyes that her mother had once called striking and her father had never mentioned at all, and hands that were good with a needle and a pen, and the particular kind of patience required to instruct children who did not want to be instructed. She had been a schoolteacher for 4 years. She had been good at it. The school board had replaced her with a man for $17 less per month, and they had not apologized for doing so. The advertisement in the Gazette had been modest in its claims, which was what had attracted her. It did not promise romance or adventure or the revelation of destiny. It promised a schoolroom, 12 students ranging from ages 6 to 14, a small house attached to the school, a wage of $20 per month, and the opportunity to serve a community that needed her specific skills. The town was Caldwell, Kansas, a cattle town on the Chisholm Trail, which she had looked up in 2 separate atlases before writing her response. She had been practical about it. She had corresponded twice with Gerald Marsh, who identified himself as the head of the town's school committee. His letters were formal and brief, and contained nothing that struck her as suspicious, because she had not yet learned to read the spaces between words for the things that men chose not to say. She had packed 2 trunks, given notice at the boarding house, written a letter to her brother Thomas, who was supposedly somewhere in Colorado, and boarded the train at Union Station on a gray May morning with $42 in a drawstring purse pinned to the inside of her corset and a determination to make something work. The train took her to Wichita. The stage took her the rest of the way south to Caldwell, 3 days of rattling misery over roads that were barely tracks, through a landscape so enormous and so indifferent that it pressed on the lungs in a way she had not anticipated. The sky was a revelation. She had grown up in a city, and she had never truly understood what sky meant until she was under this one. This vast, impossible blue with nothing in any direction to interrupt it, except the occasional stand of cottonwoods along a creek bed, and the shimmer of heat rising off the grass in long, lazy waves. She arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late May, rode dirty and stiff, and carrying all of her remaining dignity in the set of her shoulders. The town was rower than she had expected, which was saying something, because she had expected it to be raw. Main Street was a wide dirt road flanked by wooden buildings of varying ambition, most of them with the slightly temporary air of structures that had been built quickly and might be unmade just as quickly if circumstances changed. There was a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a land office, a barber, a livery stable, a bank, 3 or 4 establishments she could not immediately identify, and at the far end of the street, a small, neat building with a bell above its door that she recognized immediately as the school. That, at least, was real. Gerald Marsh met her at the stage stop. He was a thicker man than she had imagined, with a wide face and small eyes and a handshake that was slightly too firm, as though he wanted to make an impression of strength rather than welcome. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, prosperous-looking in a way that the frontier sometimes produced in men who had arrived early and positioned themselves well. He wore a good coat and polished boots and smiled at her with teeth that were better than most. "Miss Hurst, welcome to Caldwell." He took her smaller trunk without asking, which she noted. "I trust the journey wasn't too terrible." "It was fine," she said, which was not entirely true but was sufficiently close. He had arranged a room for her at the hotel for the first 2 nights, explaining that the house attached to the school needed 1 more day of preparation. She thanked him and said nothing about the fact that his letters had implied the house would be ready upon her arrival. She was good at not saying things unnecessarily. It was a skill she had developed early. It was at the hotel that evening, coming down from her room to ask about the availability of a bath, that she met Frederick Cooper. He was sitting in the small lobby, which doubled as the hotel's only common room, with a newspaper in his hands and a cup of something on the table beside him, and he looked up when she came down the stairs in the distracted, polite way of a man who glances at movement and then looks back at whatever he was reading. Then he looked up again. She would later reflect, probably not at her best in that moment. Her hair was still holding the shape of 3 days of being pressed against a stage window. She had changed her dress, but the new one was wrinkled from the trunk. She had washed her face and hands, and that was the extent of what was possible. He stood up, which surprised her, because in her experience men in common rooms of frontier hotels did not typically stand up when a woman entered unless they wanted something. "You just came in on the afternoon stage," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said, "from Wichita, originally from Cincinnati." Something shifted in his expression, and she could not tell what it was. He was a tall man, not excessively so but enough that she was aware of it, with the kind of leanness that came from work rather than deprivation, a face that was weathered in the way that faces got when they spent more time outside than in, with brown eyes that were darker than she initially registered, and a jaw that needed a razor's attention. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, though the sun made ages harder to read on men who worked outside. "I'm Frederick Cooper," he said. "I run the Cooper and Carpentry shop on 2nd Street." "Your name is Frederick Cooper and you're a Cooper," she said, and then felt immediately that she should not have said it because it came out with a note of dry amusement that was perhaps not appropriate for a first introduction in a hotel lobby. But he smiled, and it was a good smile, the kind that reached the eyes without announcing itself too loudly. "My father had a sense of humor," he said, "or a complete lack of imagination. I've gone back and forth on which." Her name was Esther Hurst, she told him. She was the new schoolteacher. The shift in his expression this time was unmistakable. It was brief, very brief, there and gone in a second, but she had spent 4 years watching children try to conceal their reactions to things, and she had become skilled at catching the ones that moved fast. What she saw on Frederick Cooper's face was not surprise exactly. It was something more like the particular tension of a person who has just received information they were both expecting and dreading. He said only that the town needed a good teacher and that she was welcome to Caldwell. He sat back down. She went to ask about the bath. She thought about the expression on his face for longer than was probably warranted. The next morning she went to see the school. It was a single room, better built than it looked from the outside, with 8 long benches, a proper blackboard, a wood stove, and a shelf that held 12 books in varying states of repair. The house attached to it was small, 2 rooms with a cast iron stove, a good bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a window that faced west so the evenings would be lit by the sunset. She stood in the middle of it and felt something open in her chest, something between hope and the cautious kind of relief that does not trust itself yet. Gerald Marsh showed her around with the air of a man showing off something he was proud of, and she asked him about the students, their ages, their backgrounds, which of them had been in school before and which had not. He answered her questions with the minimal enthusiasm of a man who considered these to be administrative details beneath his particular concerns. She noticed that he was watching her in a way she did not entirely like, a way that was slightly too focused, as though he was calculating something. She put it in the file in the back of her mind, where she stored things she had not yet decided what to do with. Over the following days, she threw herself into the work of preparing for the school's opening. She had 2 weeks before the first day of classes. She inventoried the books, made a list of what was needed, drew up a curriculum, and found that the 12 students Marsh had described were actually 9 students, 4 of whom had not been in school before in any formal sense. She also, unavoidably, kept encountering Frederick Cooper. Caldwell was not a large town. The population was perhaps 300 souls on a regular day, swelling during the cattle season when the drives came up from Texas along the Chisholm Trail, and the town briefly became a different, louder, more volatile place. In a town of 300, a person saw the same faces daily. She told herself this explained why she found herself aware of him whenever he was in the vicinity in a way she was not aware of other people. On the 3rd day, she needed wood cut to a specific length for a set of bookshelves she intended to build for the classroom. Someone at the general store told her Cooper's shop was the place to go. She went, prepared to be businesslike and brief, and found instead that Frederick Cooper's shop was a revelation. It was not simply a carpentry shop. It was the kind of space that a person with genuine skill and genuine love for what they did created, and it showed in every detail, in the way the tools were arranged, in the quality of the projects at various stages of completion, in the smell of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil that hit her when she pushed open the door. He was in the back, bent over a workbench, shaping a joint with a hand plane, and he had his sleeves rolled to the elbows in the manner of men who are working rather than performing work. She stated her requirements. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had reason to value. He asked 2 precise questions about measurements and intended use. He told her he could have it ready by the following afternoon and named a price that was entirely fair. "I'll add 10 cents for delivery," he said. "I can carry wood. Not 4 shelving boards you can't, not without taking the paint off the school door frame." She considered this. He was correct. "Fine," she said. He was at the school the next afternoon at precisely the time he had indicated, which was also a quality she had reason to value. He helped her carry the boards in and offered, without being asked and without any implication that she required assistance, to help her hang them. She told him she could hang shelves. He said he had no doubt of that, and sat down on one of the student benches and watched her do it with an expression that was not patronizing and was not flirtatious, and was something she did not have an immediate word for, something like quiet interest. She got the second shelf bracket placed wrong and had to redo it. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were thinking it loudly," she said. He laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, and she found it had the effect of making her want to hear it again, which was a piece of information she filed carefully away. That was the beginning of it, though she did not know yet what it was the beginning of. He came back to the school the following week with a small item she had not asked for, a proper chalk tray he had built to attach beneath the blackboard, one that would keep the chalk from rolling to the floor and breaking. He said he had made it because it was a practical improvement, and he had the wood scraps anyway. She thanked him. He stayed for nearly an hour, sitting on the bench again while she worked, talking about the town and the people in it with the particular candor of someone who has lived somewhere long enough to see it clearly. She asked about Gerald Marsh. The pause that followed her question was barely perceptible, but she caught it. Frederick said that Marsh was an influential man in Caldwell, that he had been one of the first to arrive when the town was being established, that he ran several interests, the land office, a majority stake in one of the saloons, and various other arrangements that were not always entirely visible from the outside. "You don't like him," she said. She said it as an observation, not an accusation. "I don't distrust him without reason," Frederick said, which was not an answer but was more revealing than a direct answer would have been. She wanted to ask what the reason was. She did not ask yet. The frontier, she was learning, had its own rhythm, its own timing, and pushing too hard too fast at the wrong moment had consequences that patience would have avoided. The school opened. The 9 students arrived on the first morning in varying states of enthusiasm and hygiene, ranging from Martha Gruber, who was 14 and had previously had 2 years of formal schooling and wanted everyone to know it, to small Billy Reardon, who was 6 years old and had never held a pencil and approached the blackboard with the caution of someone expecting it to do something unexpected. Esther loved them immediately and without reservation, which was something she had always been able to do with children that she could not always do with adults. The days developed their own shape: morning classes, noon break, afternoon classes, evenings in the small house preparing the next day's lessons, with the light coming in golden and long through the west-facing window and the sounds of the town softening as the heat broke. She learned the names of the cattle drovers who passed through and the families who had homesteaded out on the surrounding plain. She learned which of the 2 saloons was merely loud and which was genuinely dangerous. She learned that Frederick Cooper had come to Caldwell from Missouri 4 years earlier, that he lived alone in a house on the edge of town, and that he was regarded by virtually everyone she spoke to with a kind of steady, uncomplicated respect that she found more telling than any amount of active praise would have been. She also learned that Gerald Marsh was watching her in a way that had moved beyond calculation into something she could only describe as possession. It was Frederick who told her, on an evening in the first week of June when they had fallen into the habit of walking together after supper along the street that ran parallel to the main road, the quieter one that went past the church and out toward the creek. He told her carefully, in the way of a person who has been deciding for some time how to say something, and has chosen the most direct route as both the kindest and the most respectful. The school committee, he said, did not actually have a position for a teacher. Caldwell had a teacher. Had had one for 3 years, a man named Perkins who had left 2 months ago to marry in Wichita but who, as of Frederick's understanding, had not formally resigned. The vacancy Marsh had advertised was not technically a vacancy. She stopped walking. "Then why," she said, with the careful enunciation of someone keeping their voice very level, "did he bring me here?" Frederick's hands were in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the ground ahead of them rather than at her, which she recognized as the posture of a person saying something uncomfortable. Marsh has been looking to expand his land holdings. He's been purchasing parcels from families that are struggling, families who owe at the bank which he has an interest in. He's been buying their debt and then the land. He paused. He's been alone for 2 years since his wife went back east. He's made it known in certain circles that he intended to bring out a woman of quality. The silence that followed this had its own texture, thick and sharp at the same time. "He brought me here," Esther said slowly, each word placed with precision, not as a teacher but as a prospective wife. "That's what I believe, yes. Without asking me. Without asking you." She stood very still for a moment, looking at the last of the light over the flat horizon. The anger was there, clean and sharp, but beneath it was something worse than anger, which was the particular shame of having been treated as an object in a transaction she had not known she was party to, of having been moved across a continent like a piece in someone else's game. "You knew," she said. "When I came into the hotel that first evening, you already knew." "I had suspicions. I didn't know for certain." "Why didn't you tell me then?" He was quiet for a beat. "Because I could have been wrong. And because you would have had nowhere to go and nothing to do if I'd told you before you'd had time to settle, and I didn't want to take away the week of believing it was real before I was sure enough to say something." It was such a specific, considered, human reason that she could not be angry at it, though she was angry at everything else. "And now you're sure." "I spoke with the land office clerk this afternoon. The teaching position was never filed with the county. Marsh has no legal authority to hire a teacher independently. The school committee consists of 3 men, and the other 2 told me today they knew nothing about any advertisement." She turned and they walked back toward the school in silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but is full to the edges of things being processed. "What do I do?" she asked, and she did not ask it of him specifically. She asked it of the night and the situation and the approximately $17 she had left after the journey, but he answered it anyway. "You have a choice," he said. "You can leave. I'll lend you the stage fare back to Wichita. No strings, no obligation, just a loan. Or," she said, "or you stay. The school committee, the real one, meets next Tuesday. If you're willing to make your case, I'll speak on your behalf. The actual teaching position, a legitimate one, is yours to apply for. You're qualified. More qualified than anyone this town has had. And Marsh doesn't control the committee, whatever he believes." She looked at him then, really looked at him in the diminishing light, and tried to read what was behind the offer. She had a talent for reading people, and what she read in Frederick Cooper was something she did not immediately trust, because it seemed too straightforward, too unencumbered by the hidden motives she had learned to look for in men who offered things. What she read was simple concern and simple respect, and something else underneath both of those that was newer and less settled in him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because you came here in good faith and you deserve to be treated with the same." She nodded slowly. She said she would think about it. She went inside. She did not sleep for a long time that night, lying in the good bed in the small house, listening to the sounds of the frontier dark, the distant sounds of the saloon, the wind moving through the grass, something calling out in the dark from far away that might have been a coyote. She thought about Cincinnati and the boarding house and the school board and the $17. She thought about the 9 children who had come to her classroom that first morning, with their varying levels of willingness and their varying capacities for wonder. She thought about Frederick Cooper sitting on the student bench watching her hang shelves, not offering to help, simply being present in a way that was neither intrusive nor absent. In the morning she put on her best dress, brushed her hair into strict order, and went to find Gerald Marsh. She did not confront him with everything. She was not yet ready to show what she knew, and she had learned that showing a person you know their secrets prematurely was tactically foolish. She told him only that she had heard there might be some question about the formality of her appointment, and that she intended to appear before the school committee on Tuesday to have her position properly confirmed. Marsh's face did something complicated. He said there was no need for that her position was perfectly secure, that the committee was a mere formality. He said it in the smooth, assured tone of a man who was used to managing situations. She smiled pleasantly and said she would feel better having it formalized, and was there anything else he needed from her? The smile that remained on his face after she turned away was the one that did not reach the small eyes, and she felt it on the back of her neck all the way to the end of the street. The Tuesday meeting was a different kind of confrontation from the one she was used to. The school committee met in the back room of the land office. 3 men whose names were Henderson, Kowalski, and Bryce, all of them solid citizens of the farming and mercantile variety who had children of school age and a genuine interest in education that Marsh did not share. Frederick was there, not as a committee member but as a resident in good standing who had asked to speak. Esther presented her credentials, her years of teaching experience, her letters of reference from Cincinnati, her description of the curriculum she had already begun implementing. She was precise and thorough and answered every question directly. She was also, beneath the composed surface she presented, deeply aware that her entire future for the foreseeable future rested on the next 30 minutes. Henderson, who was the committee chair, a broad, slow-spoken man who ran the feed store and had a daughter named Clara who was one of Esther's 9 students, said after a long consideration that as far as he was concerned the position was hers, and had been since the moment she showed up to the school with her own list of questions. Kowalski and Bryce seconded this. Then Henderson looked at Marsh, who had arrived uninvited and was standing in the corner with his arms folded, and said with the particular calm of a man who has made a decision he intends to stand behind, that the school committee's business was the school committee's business, and Marsh's presence was not required for it. Marsh left. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately, the way a room changes when something that has been pressing on it from outside stops pressing. She was the schoolteacher of Caldwell, Kansas, with a contract, a wage, and a house. It was official. Frederick was waiting outside the land office when she came out. He was leaning against the hitching post with his arms folded, watching the street with the particular patience he had, and when he saw her face he read it correctly without needing to be told. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. I just said what was true. You said it at the right time to the right people, which is not the same as simply saying what's true." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite the full smile but the predecessor of it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Someone who might need more rescuing, I suppose." "I don't need rescuing," she said. "I need support occasionally, which is entirely different." "Yes," he said. "I'm learning that." They stood there in the street in the late afternoon sun, which was doing something extraordinary to the light, turning everything gold and long-shadowed, and there was a particular charge to the air between them that was new. It was not unpleasant. It was, in fact, the opposite of unpleasant, which was itself a kind of problem because problems in Caldwell had not finished arriving. Marsh did not take his displacement gracefully. In the week that followed the committee meeting, small things began to go wrong. One morning she arrived at the school to find the front door lock had been jammed with something, requiring the assistance of Mr. Henderson's son to unjam it. 2 of the students told her their fathers had been visited by a man who worked for Marsh, asking questions about whether the children were actually learning anything useful. The owner of the general store, who had been perfectly civil, suddenly found himself unable to extend her the small credit account that every resident of the town used routinely. None of it was large enough to act on directly. All of it had the fingerprints of coordinated pressure. She told Frederick about it one evening on their walk. She had learned, without either of them formally acknowledging it, to look for him in the early evenings at the point where 2nd Street met the quieter road, where he sometimes appeared as though he simply happened to be going the same direction. She had decided not to examine this coincidence too closely because she enjoyed it and because she was choosing, for once, to let something simply be what it appeared to be. He listened. He did not minimize what she described or suggest she was reading too much into it, which was a response she had encountered often enough from men to have prepared herself for it. "He's testing what he can get away with," Frederick said. "Small things that can't be pinned on him, seeing if it accumulates. And if it does. He pushes harder." He paused. "Marsh has done this before, with a homesteader named Fulton 2 years ago. He made things uncomfortable in small ways until Fulton's wife wanted to leave, and then Fulton sold the claim cheap just to end it. He thinks I'm easier to move than a homesteader," she said. "He underestimates you," Frederick said, and he said it without emphasis, as a simple statement of observed fact, and it did something to her that simple statements of observed fact did not ordinarily do. She stopped walking. He stopped a step later and turned to look at her, and the evening light was doing the thing it did out here that light in Cincinnati had never done, making the whole world feel like it was made of something softer and more honest than ordinary daylight revealed. "Frederick," she said. "Yes." She was not entirely sure what she intended to say next. She had been careful, very careful, not to let whatever was happening between them move faster than she could think clearly about it, because she was already in one situation she had not chosen with full information, and she was not prepared to enter another one. But there was something in this moment, in the warmth of the evening and the particular quality of his attention, that made caution feel less like wisdom and more like fear dressed up as wisdom. "I'm grateful for you," she said. "Not for what you've done specifically, though that too, for how you've done it." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said. "I know I don't. That's not why I'm saying it." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it because I want to and because I'm trying to be honest with you about what I'm feeling, which is something I tend to avoid when it feels risky, and this feels risky." "What feels risky?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, careful, with something underneath the carefulness that matched what she was trying to say. "This," she said, and she meant the evening and the walk and the two of them in it, and he understood that perfectly. He reached out and took her hand with the same deliberate care he applied to the joints in his carpentry, fitting it into his with a precision that was not tentative and was not presumptuous, but was something in between that felt exactly right. And they stood there for a moment in the long evening light with the prairie all around them and the sounds of the town behind them and something new and terrifying and entirely extraordinary beginning between them. Then he said, very quietly, "I should tell you something." She waited. "When you first came to the hotel, when you told me who you were and why you were here, I already knew your name." "You knew my name?" She looked at him. "Marsh told me, 2 weeks before you arrived. He told me he was bringing a woman from Cincinnati for a purpose he didn't specify but implied. He was showing off, I think, wanting someone to know he had the means to arrange things the way he wanted them." He paused. "I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know you. I thought about writing to the Gazette to warn whoever had answered the advertisement, but I didn't know if that would reach you in time or if it would matter if it did." She was processing this, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. "You felt guilty that evening in the hotel." "Yes. Because you knew what he'd done and you hadn't been able to prevent it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The guilt was comprehensible to her. The fact that he was telling her now rather than letting it remain a secret she would never have known was more comprehensible than the guilt. "You didn't do it," she said, "and you told me when it mattered. I should have acted faster." "Probably," she agreed. "But you acted." She looked at him steadily. "That's what matters to me." He squeezed her hand once gently, and they turned and walked back toward the town as the last light went out of the sky and the stars began to appear above the prairie. More stars than she had ever seen from a city street, so many of them that it seemed impossible they had always been there, and she had simply never been somewhere dark enough to see them. She thought, walking back with her hand in his, that she was beginning to understand what the frontier actually was. Not hardship, though there was hardship. Not deprivation, though there was that too. It was space. It was the largest amount of uninterrupted space she had ever been inside, and in that space things could be seen clearly because there was nothing between you and them. She could see Frederick Cooper clearly. She was not sure she had ever been able to see anyone that clearly before. The trouble with Marsh came to a head faster than she had anticipated. On a Thursday morning 10 days after the committee meeting, she arrived at the school to find a letter nailed to the door. It was addressed to her in Marsh's handwriting, and it informed her, in language that was legal in structure but threatening in implication, that the house she occupied was on land that was technically part of a parcel he controlled through the bank, and that the school committee's lease arrangement had a deficiency that he intended to pursue through the county court unless a private arrangement could be reached. Private arrangement. She understood what private arrangement meant. She stood in the early morning light with the letter in her hands and felt the particular coldness of a threat that is dressed in legitimate clothing, the kind of threat that is harder to fight than an open one because it forces you to argue the mechanism rather than the intent. She showed it to Frederick that afternoon. He read it twice without speaking. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back to her and said 3 things. First, the land arrangement was almost certainly a bluff, because the school had been built on a town lot that had been deeded to the school committee 3 years before Marsh had any interest in the adjacent parcel, and precedent in Kansas land law was clear on this point. Second, Henderson and the committee should see the letter today. Third, and he said this with a quiet directness that she had come to recognize as the register he used when he was saying something he felt deeply, Marsh was not going to move her out of this town and he would not allow it. That's not your decision to make alone, she said. No, he agreed immediately. It's not. I'm telling you how I feel about it, not what you should do. She was with Henderson by 4 o'clock that afternoon. Henderson read the letter with the slow, systematic attention of a man who was not easily alarmed, and then he looked at her with the kind of steady steadiness she had come to associate with the best of the people she had found in this town. He's overplaying his hand, Henderson said. The parcel claim won't hold. I'll have our lawyer in Wichita confirm it by telegram by tomorrow noon. She nodded, she thanked him. Walking home, she allowed herself to feel the shape of what was happening, the particular ugliness of a man who used the legitimate structures of property and law as instruments of control and coercion. She had seen it in other forms, in the school board in Cincinnati that had used the legitimate structure of economic necessity to push her out. It was the same mechanism, different clothes. She was tired of it. She was, she realized, more than tired. She was angry in a clean, certain way that was not volatile but was very, very resolved. That evening she wrote a letter to the county seat, detailing the situation with precision and requesting an inquiry into the circumstances of her hiring, including the fraudulent advertisement and the implication of what it had been placed for. She wrote it as a schoolteacher, carefully, with attention to fact and chronology, and the avoidance of anything that could be dismissed as hysterical or personal. It was a very good letter. She knew it was. She showed it to Frederick the next morning, and he read it standing in the doorway of her house with the early sun behind him and his coffee in his other hand. And when he looked up he said, "Esther," and then stopped. "What?" she asked. "This is exactly right," he said. "This is exactly what it should be." "Then why did you say my name like that?" "Because," he said with a kind of helpless, honest bewilderment that was very unlike his usual composure, "I keep being surprised by you and I'm not sure why, because you've been nothing but exactly this from the beginning." She looked at him for a long moment in the morning light. "Frederick," she said, "would you like to come in for coffee?" He looked at the cup in his hand. "I have coffee." "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He came in. The letter went to the county by the end of the week. The confirmation of the school lot's legal status came back from the Wichita lawyer by telegram the following Tuesday. Henderson presented Marsh with both documents on a Wednesday morning, and she heard from 3 different people by noon that Marsh had been seen leaving the land office with the particular tight-shouldered walk of a man who has overplayed his hand and knows it. He did not approach her directly again. He was not done, though. The frontier taught her that people who had been publicly reduced had a way of finding smaller, sharper methods of retaliation. Marsh's next move was subtler and in some ways more effective, because it went after something she could not easily defend with legal documents. He began talking, not openly, not in ways she could name and address, but in the particular social way that small communities were vulnerable to, a word here, a suggestion there, a question asked with an innocent face to the right people. Was it appropriate for the schoolteacher to be seen walking in the evenings with a man she was not promised to? Was she perhaps not as properly qualified as she claimed? Had anyone actually verified her references from Cincinnati? And was not the school in Cincinnati a private one rather than a public school board appointment? Most of it had the opposite effect of what he intended, because most of the people of Caldwell had formed their own opinions of Esther Hurst by this point, and were not inclined to trade them for Gerald Marsh's commentary. But some of it landed. She saw it in the slightly more measured nod from Mrs. Kowalski at the general store. She heard it in the slightly more formal courtesy of two of the fathers who had previously been warm. What she did not hear, and what she had perhaps been waiting for and dreading, was any uncertainty from Frederick. He appeared at the school on the Friday afternoon of that particular week, with nothing in particular that needed doing and no pretext beyond simply appearing, and she let him sit on his usual bench while she graded spelling papers. After a while he said, without preamble, that he had heard what Marsh was saying about the two of them, and he wanted her to know that it did not change anything for him except that he was sorry she was being subjected to it. "Are you going to say something about propriety?" she asked. "No," he said. "Are you going to suggest we should be more careful about being seen together?" "No," he said. "Are you going to propose we address the situation by—" She stopped. She had been going to say something carefully circular, and she realized she did not want to say it that way. She put down the spelling papers. "Are you going to ask me to marry you because it solves a social problem?" The question sat in the air between them, sharp-edged and direct. "No," he said, and the quality of the no was different from the previous ones. It was more deliberate, more emphatic, the no of a person making a commitment, not a deflection. She let out a breath. "Good. If I ask you to marry me," he said, and the if sat in the air now instead, with its own weight, "it won't be because of Gerald Marsh. It won't be because of what people are saying or what makes things easier or what solves a problem." He was looking at her with an absolute directness that was characteristic of him and that she had come to depend on. "It will be because I am in love with you and I want to spend whatever time I have left in this world making it a place you want to be in." The silence after that had a different quality from any other silence she had experienced in the last several weeks. She set down the grading pen carefully. "When did that happen?" she asked. "The love." He considered this seriously, as he considered all serious things. "I think it happened in pieces. The first piece was when you told me my name was funny and then immediately looked like you regretted saying it, and then didn't apologize for it, because it was true." She laughed. She had not laughed in several days, and it came out bigger than she intended, warm and real, and without any of the careful management she usually applied to her expressions. He was smiling at her, the full version this time, the one that took over his whole face, and she thought that she had been adding up pieces too, piece by piece over the weeks since the hotel lobby, and that she had been keeping the sum deliberately uncounted because she was afraid of what the total was, and that she was done being afraid of it. She got up from her desk and crossed the classroom to where he was sitting on the bench, and she sat down beside him, close, the way you sat beside someone you had chosen, and she took his hand the way he had taken hers that evening by the creek road, fitting her fingers through his. "The if is unnecessary," she said, "in case you wanted to know." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the specific, individual pieces of what she had just said land in him, watched his expression move through understanding to something she could only describe as joy, deep and quiet, and entirely real. He kissed her then, gently and without hurry, In the middle of the schoolroom, with the afternoon sun coming in through the windows and the chalk tray he had built for her on the board and the spelling papers on the desk. And it was the kind of kiss that arrived like a conclusion rather than a beginning, the end of one kind of living and the start of another. This was the Tuesday before the livery stable. She had not yet known, sitting in the schoolroom with Frederick's hand in hers, that Marsh's frustration had moved past social maneuvering and into something darker. She had not known that the threats he could not make openly he had decided to make in a different register, one that involved a conversation with Frederick in the livery stable, one that involved a revolver, one that involved the hope that Frederick Cooper, if sufficiently frightened, would leave Caldwell, and that Esther Hurst, without him, might be more isolated and manageable. She found out later from Frederick that Marsh had sent word asking him to come to the livery stable for a private conversation about a property matter. Frederick had gone, not without suspicion, but unwilling to ignore a summons that might have legitimate content. He had arrived to find Marsh there with 2 drinks poured and a gun at his belt, and the particular look of a man who had arrived at the point where subtlety had stopped working and brute force seemed like the remaining option. The conversation had gone badly from Marsh's perspective almost immediately, because Frederick was not the kind of person who responded to intimidation by becoming cooperative. He became more still, more direct, and he told Marsh, with a clarity that apparently infuriated the man, exactly what he thought the situation was and what the appropriate resolution of it looked like, which was Marsh accepting that Esther Hurst was not moving, not acquiescing, not going to become the private arrangement he had imported her for, and that the decent thing to do was to back down and let Caldwell go back to being a town where business was conducted without coercion. Marsh pulled the gun. And that was where Esther arrived, having been told by young Billy Reardon, who had been passing the livery on his way home from school, that something was happening in there that he thought the schoolteacher should know about. She had walked through the door to find Frederick against the wall and Marsh with a revolver and the entire confrontation already in progress. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the middle of the stable and said, in the quiet, clear, carry-across-a-classroom voice she used when she needed 12 children to stop immediately, "Put the gun down, Mr. Marsh." Marsh's eyes moved to her and the gun tracked with them, moving between her and Frederick, and on his face was the particular expression of a man who has gone further than he intended and is not entirely sure how to back down from it. "This doesn't concern you," Marsh said. "Everything that happens in this town concerns me," Esther said. She walked forward 2 steps, which was not cautious and was possibly not wise, but was also the only thing she could think to do because the only tool she had in this moment was presence and conviction, and the refusal to be frightened into being small. "I live here. I teach here. I am not going to be moved from here by you or anyone else, and you know it. The county knows it. The committee knows it." She looked at him with the steady, unflinching look she had for children who were misbehaving badly and needed to be seen rather than managed. "This gun does not change any of that. All it does is take a difficult situation and make it a criminal one, and I do not believe you want that." The silence was several seconds long. Frederick, she saw from the corner of her eye, had lowered his hands very slowly, not reaching for his own weapon but standing up straight, no longer against the wall, present and steady. Marsh looked at her. He looked at Frederick. He looked at the gun in his own hand as though he was seeing it from the outside for the first time. He lowered it. It happened in the space of a breath, the hammer uncocking, the arm dropping, the whole rigid architecture of the confrontation releasing its tension in a single long exhale. Marsh stood there with the revolver at his side and something on his face that was not remorse exactly, but was its neighbor. "Get out of my way," he said, very quietly, and she stepped aside. He left. She stood in the middle of the livery for a moment with the smell of hay and horses all around her, and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. Then Frederick was there, crossing the space between them in 4 steps, and she felt his hands on her arms, steadying, not restraining. "Esther," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You walked into a gun. It wasn't pointed at me. It was in the vicinity of pointed at you." His voice was not quite steady now, and she realized with a startled attention that he had been frightened not for himself but for her. She turned to face him fully and put both hands on either side of his face, which was something she had not done before and which felt entirely necessary. "I am fine," she said more softly. "Are you fine?" He put his hands over hers, holding them against his jaw. "I will be," he said. "Give me a moment." She gave him the moment. They stood like that in the livery stable, which was not a romantic setting by any stretch of imagination, and it did not matter at all. Gerald Marsh left Caldwell within the week. It was not sudden and not dramatic. His departure had the practical quality of a man who had done a cost-benefit analysis and found that his remaining options in a town where his schemes were understood and his reputation was compromised were limited. He sold his land office interest and his saloon stake to different buyers, and one morning he was simply not there. His house shuttered, his name already beginning to soften at the edges the way names do when the person behind them is no longer present to maintain their weight. The town breathed differently after he left. Not dramatically, not with visible relief, but in the small ways that places breathe differently when a source of pressure has been removed. Esther noticed it in the way Mrs. Kowalski greeted her on Thursday morning, warm again, without the slight reservation. She noticed it in the way Henderson brought his daughter Clara to school that week with a bag of apples for the classroom, and said, with the understatement of a man who communicated in facts rather than sentiments, that she was doing good work. The summer deepened. The cattle drives came up from Texas, turning Caldwell into a different, louder, more populated version of itself for 6 weeks, and she navigated the temporary wildness of a cattle drive town with a combination of patience and firm lines, insisting that her students still attend school during the week even as the town around them became temporarily foreign. Frederick came by on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of cattle season with what she initially took for a social call, and turned out to be something else. He stood in the doorway of her house with his hat in his hands and the particular composed composure of a man who had been working up to something, and she put the kettle on before he said anything because it seemed like the kind of conversation that required tea. "I spoke to Reverend Calloway this week," he said. She got the cups down from the shelf. "Did you?" "I spoke to him about the availability of performing a ceremony." She was glad she was facing the stove and not him because she needed the 2 seconds that provided to put her expression into order. She turned around with the teacups and looked at him steadily. "A ceremony," she said. "He says any Saturday morning works for him." He met her eyes. "Esther, I told you in the schoolroom that the if was in there and you told me the if was unnecessary." He paused. "I'd like to take you at your word if you'll let me." She set the cups down on the table between them. She sat down in her chair. She looked at him. This man she had known for less than 2 months. This man who had told her uncomfortable truths when they were necessary and withheld them when they would have been premature. Who had sat on a schoolroom bench and watched her hang shelves and built her a chalk tray without being asked, and held her hands in the livery stable, and been frightened for her in a way he expressed through steadiness rather than panic. She had come to this territory with $42 and a determination to make something work. She had not come looking for this. But the frontier, she was learning, had a way of showing you the things you needed by placing them directly in front of you when you had nowhere to look but forward. "Reverend Calloway said any Saturday?" she asked. "Any Saturday," he confirmed. "Tell him the last Saturday of July," she said. "I need 3 weeks to write to my brother." His face did the thing it did, the thing she loved, the smile that moved from the inside out. 3 weeks, he said. "And tell him we'd like the morning light through the church windows," she added. "I've seen what the morning light does in that church. I'd like to be married in it." He looked at her for a long moment with everything he felt for her entirely visible on his face, all of it, without any management or restraint, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever been looked at with. 3 weeks, he said again. "The last Saturday of July, Morning light. She poured the tea. She wrote to Thomas that evening a long letter, the longest she had written him in years. She told him about the frontier and the school and the 9 children and the prairie sky, and the way the evenings went golden over the flat land. She told him about Marsh and about what had happened and about what had not happened because of it. She told him about Frederick Cooper, starting from the hotel lobby and the remark about the name, and she found that in the writing of it she understood more clearly what it was she had found in this territory she had come to expecting to simply endure. Thomas's reply came by the last post before the wedding, from a mining camp outside Leadville, Colorado, written in his familiar, slightly illegible hand. He was well. He was, in fact, doing reasonably well. He was sorry not to be there. He was glad she was happy. He asked her to describe the man to him in detail, and said that she sounded, in her letter, like a person who had been given back to herself. She read it twice, in the evening light through her west-facing window, her last evening as Esther Hurst in the small house attached to the school, and she thought that Thomas had always been better at saying the precise thing than she had, and that he was exactly right. The wedding was on the last Saturday of July, 1878, in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, with the morning light coming through the east-facing windows exactly as she had specified, falling across the simple arrangement of wildflowers that Clara Henderson had brought and arranged on the altar with the specific solemnity of a 14-year-old who takes ceremonies very seriously. The whole school committee was there. Most of the town was there, in the easy way that frontier towns showed up for occasions that were occasions, because there were not so many of them that people could afford to miss the ones that presented themselves. The church was not large, but it held everyone who came. She wore her best dress, which was the blue one with the ivory collar that she had been saving for circumstances whose specific nature she had not been able to predict, and she braided her hair herself in the dark of the early morning because she did not have anyone to help her, and she was entirely capable of braiding her own hair. And she put on her mother's small pearl earrings that she had carried from Cincinnati in the inner pocket of her second-best bag. Frederick stood at the front of the church in a coat she had not seen before, dark and properly pressed, and when she walked down the aisle she watched his face change the way it changed when something moved him deeply, that controlled, honest expressiveness that was so particularly his. Reverend Calloway married them with the brief, sincere words of a man who believed in what he was doing, and the responses they made to each other were quiet and clear in the morning light. And when it was done in the way that real things are done, fully and without residue. The town ate together after in the yard behind the church, which was the frontier way of celebrating occasions, everyone contributing something. The tables improvised from boards over sawhorses, the food excessive and entirely delicious, and there was dancing in the afternoon to a fiddle player who came up from the second saloon that was only loud and not dangerous, and who played with genuine skill. She danced with Frederick in the afternoon light, not well. She was not a natural dancer, but with the particular joy of a person who does not care whether they are doing it well, and he was not much better, which helped, and Clara Henderson watched them from the side with the intense focus of a romantic who was cataloging everything. They moved into Frederick's house that evening, a more substantial house than the one attached to the school, 3 proper rooms and a porch that faced east for the morning. She had contributed the west-facing window from her old house, which Frederick had uninstalled and reinstalled in the bedroom of the new house with characteristic precision. So she had the morning light from the east and the evening light from the west, and she found that in between these 2 lights was a home. The autumn came in over the prairie in a way she had not anticipated, not with the abrupt departure of summer she knew from Ohio, but with a slow, gorgeous transformation of the grassland from green to gold to brown, and the sky changed too, becoming deeper and bluer and more extravagant in its clarity as the heat eased. She had thought the summer prairie was beautiful. The autumn one was something else. The school year settled into its full rhythm. Her 9 students became 11 when 2 families arrived from Iowa in September, bringing with them a boy of 10 named Marcus who had apparently been told school was optional and was going to learn otherwise, and a girl of 8 named Ruth who was so eager for books that Esther had to impose a limit on how many she could borrow at once, because Ruth would stay up all night reading and arrive in the morning with shadows under her eyes and another book finished. Esther found these problems entirely rewarding. Frederick came by the school most afternoons, usually with some plausible errand, a delivery of wood for the stove as the evenings got cold, a repair of a bench that needed doing. She did not examine the pretext too closely. She enjoyed the presence. She had, over the months, lost the caution she had initially maintained between enjoyment and acknowledgement of it, and she found that things were considerably better when you allowed yourself to simply know what you knew. They talked in the evenings on the porch and in the mornings over coffee at the kitchen table, which had been built by his hands with the same care he applied to everything, and she discovered that living with a person whose craft was making things was a particular kind of luxury she had not expected. The house was beautiful in a quiet, functional way, every joint properly fitted, every shelf level, every door hanging exactly right, and there was something in daily life in a space built with that quality of attention that made the ordinary feel like something more. She also discovered over the autumn that Frederick had a history he had not yet fully told her, not because he was hiding it but because they had come together quickly, and some things take longer to arrive at than others. He had come from Missouri, she knew that. He had come west 4 years before she arrived. What he told her on a November evening, with the first real cold pressing at the windows and the stove keeping the kitchen warm, was that he had been engaged to be married in Missouri to a woman named Anna, and that Anna had died of typhoid fever 6 weeks before the wedding date, in the summer of 1874. He told it plainly, without excessive weight but without minimizing it either, and she listened to it the same way, with the attention she gave to things that were true and mattered. "Is that why you came west?" she asked. "Partly," he said. "Partly because there was nothing holding me there anymore. Partly because I wanted to see if there was something else out here that was worth making things for." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "Did you find it?" He looked at her, and the look was the same as all the others, entirely honest, nothing held back. "I found considerably more than I was looking for," he said. She got up from her chair and went around the table and kissed him with the warmth of late autumn and the stove and the life they had been building and the particular tenderness of a person who has just been trusted with something precious. Winter settled over the prairie, and she found that winter on the frontier had a quality entirely its own. The cold was serious, not the damp chill of an Ohio winter, but a dry, bright, profound cold that made the mornings sharp and clear, and the air on the walk to school taste like something clean and new. The grass was silver with frost in the early light, and the sky above it was the particular blue that only came when the air was very cold and very clear. She kept the school stove running well. She borrowed an extra quilt for the coldest days when the stove could not quite keep the corners warm, and she instituted a policy of reading aloud for the first hour of morning classes, which kept everyone still and together and warm, and which had the additional benefit of introducing her students to books they would not have found on their own. Marcus, the reluctant scholar, turned out to have a fierce aptitude for mathematics that she nurtured carefully, approaching it sideways so that he thought he was solving puzzles rather than doing schoolwork, until the puzzles and the schoolwork had become indistinguishable, and he was solving them eagerly regardless of what they were called. Christmas came with a simplicity she found more moving than the elaborate Cincinnati celebrations she had grown up with. The town gathered at the church, and there was a tree cut from the creek bottom and decorated with what people had, which was various and charming, and Reverend Calloway gave a short, good sermon, and then the town went home to their various tables. She and Frederick ate Christmas dinner alone in their kitchen, which she had spent the day making into something worthy of the occasion, and he gave her a gift he had been working on for 2 months in the shop, a writing desk for the bedroom, made from a beautiful piece of walnut he had been saving, with a slant top and small drawers along the side, exactly the right size, exactly the right height, the best thing she owned. She gave him a wool vest she had knitted over the same 2 months, which she told him was not as fine as the desk, and he told her it was finer, because it was warm and he would wear it every day, and he put it on immediately over his shirt and wore it for the rest of the evening, and she could not remember ever having been quite this happy before in a Christmas, which was not a complicated observation, but was a very genuine one. In January, she realized she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning with the winter light coming through the east window, having already considered and prepared for every response she could imagine. The response she got was none of the ones she had prepared for. He simply went very still for a moment looking at her, and then his face broke open in a way she had never quite seen it do before, something completely unguarded, something that was so completely joy that it had no other ingredients at all. He crossed the room and put his arms around her with a care that was somehow both strong and gentle simultaneously, and she felt him breathe against her hair, and he said, very quietly, "Esther." "I know," she said, "it's a great deal. It's wonderful," he said. "It's also terrifying," she said. "Also that," he agreed. They held each other in the Sunday morning light while the frontier winter pressed at the windows, and the stove kept the kitchen warm, and she thought about how much had happened since the August morning she had boarded a train in Cincinnati with $42 and a determination to make something work. She wrote to Thomas again. She had been writing to Thomas regularly now, and his letters from the Colorado mining camp were becoming more settled in tone, less like the letters of a man wandering, and more like the letters of a man who had found a place to put down roots. He wrote back about the pregnancy with a delight that made her laugh, and he said he intended to come to Caldwell as soon as the mountain passes cleared, because he wanted to meet Frederick Cooper and verify for himself that the man was worthy of his sister. Spring came back to the prairie as though it had never been gone, the grass greening almost overnight after the last frost, the cottonwoods along the creeks going from bare to leaf in the space of 2 weeks, and the sky returning to its full summer blue over a world that was fresh and new and entirely ready for what was coming. Thomas arrived in April, thinner than she remembered and more sun-darkened, and with a beard he had not had in Cincinnati, riding in on a bay horse he had bought in Wichita and arriving at their door on a Thursday afternoon with his hat in his hand, and his face breaking into the smile she had not seen in 3 years. She hugged him for a long time. She was visibly pregnant by April, 5 months along, and he stepped back and looked at her with a wondering expression that she recognized as the particular emotion of a brother seeing his sister become someone else's family without quite losing being his. He and Frederick found each other in the way that men sometimes do, carefully at first and then with increasing ease, talking about horses and carpentry and the specifics of mining versus cattle country, and she watched from the kitchen while she made supper and felt the particular pleasure of watching 2 of her people become acquainted. Thomas stayed 2 weeks. He helped Frederick with a large order that had come in from a homesteader family needing furniture, working alongside him in the shop with the willingness of a man who was used to physical work and did not mind turning his hand to something unfamiliar. By the end of the 2 weeks, they had the comfortable ease of people who have worked together at something real. When he left, he shook Frederick's hand and then pulled him forward by it into a brief, backslapping embrace that surprised Frederick visibly and pleased him enormously. He kissed Esther's cheek and held her hands and told her she had chosen extraordinarily well. "I know," she said. "You also look extremely well," he said. "Frontier life suits you." "More than I expected," she said. "Considerably more." He rode out on a Tuesday morning with the spring light on the grass, and she watched him go until he was a small shape at the edge of the horizon, and then a smaller one and then not there at all. And she felt the ordinary, manageable grief of parting with someone you know you will see again, which is entirely different from the kind that isn't sure. The baby came in mid-June, on a hot evening when the prairie was at its fullest and loudest, with the doctor, Dr. Whitmore, in attendance, and Frederick in the next room doing what Frederick did when he was managing something overwhelming, which was moving furniture quietly and then moving it back. She labored through the long evening and into the early night, and the baby arrived in the first hour past midnight, healthy and urgent, with the particular insistence of a person who has decided to enter the world on his own schedule. It was a boy. Frederick came in when Dr. Whitmore allowed him, and she held the baby out to him, this small, loud, completely astonishing person who had not existed the morning before, and she watched Frederick take him with the same hands that joined wood and built things, careful and precise and completely certain, and she watched him look at his son for the first time. She had seen Frederick's face do many things in the nearly year she had known him, but this was something she had not yet seen and suspected she would not see again in quite this specific form. This particular first encounter with something entirely new that was also entirely his, and she kept it in her memory with the same care she had kept the other moments. The morning light in the church, the evening light by the creek, the kitchen table conversations, all of it. They named him James Thomas Cooper, James for Frederick's father and Thomas for her brother, and Thomas Hurst received the news in a letter 3 weeks later at a new address in Colorado, no longer the mining camp but a house in a small town, and his reply came back with an energy she had not heard from him in years, full of plans to visit by summer's end, and with news of his own that she read with astonishment and then immense delight, which was that he had met a woman, a teacher herself as it happened, and intended to marry her in the fall. The family was growing in all directions. James was a vigorous, alert, opinionated baby who slept in the way that suited him rather than the way that suited the household, and who had, by 2 months of age, figured out how to produce an expression of complete innocence, so convincing that it took her and Frederick several days to realize it had no relationship to actual innocence. He had Frederick's eyes, darker than she had expected, and her hair, which she knew was going to be thick and complicated, and something in the particular set of his chin that was entirely his own. She took him to school in September, when she returned to teaching, in a basket that sat beside her desk, and the older children took turns watching him during her morning reading hour with a solemnity that suggested they understood they had been entrusted with something important. Marcus, who had come a very long way from the boy who had been told school was optional, was particularly good at this, settling James with a calm authority that suggested he had a gift for small children that he had not yet discovered about himself. The second year of her tenure in Caldwell was different from the first in the way that all second years were different, more settled, more itself, less defined by novelty and crisis, and more defined by the accumulation of ordinary life well lived. She knew her students deeply now, knew their particular angles of understanding and their individual resistances and the specific methods that worked for each of them. She knew the town and the town knew her. She was unambiguously one of its people. In October of that second year, on an evening when James was asleep in his basket and the first cool weather was coming through the open bedroom window, she was sitting at the walnut writing desk he had made her, writing to Thomas and his new wife Louise when Frederick came and stood in the doorway. She could tell from the way he stood there that he had something to say. She turned around. "What?" she asked. "Nothing bad," he said immediately, knowing her the way he knew her. "I've been offered a commission from the new hotel they're building in Wichita. The whole interior fit-out, doors, trim, built-in furnishings for 12 rooms. She looked at him. "It's a large commission." "The largest I've had. It would take most of a winter to complete." "In Wichita," she said. "They've offered the use of their existing carpenter's workshop there." He paused. "I don't want to be away from you and James for the winter, but I also don't want to turn it down without talking to you about it first." She considered. James was 4 months old. The winter was long. A winter without him in the evenings and the mornings was something she could imagine clearly enough to know it would be difficult. "Is there a way to do it without staying in Wichita?" she asked. "If I went up on Monday mornings and came back Friday evenings," he said, "I could complete it by March. It would be slower, but possible." "Then do it that way," she said. "You're sure?" "Frederick," she said, with the particular patience she had for questions that were already answered, "you built this house and the desk I'm sitting at and the chest where James sleeps and the shelves in my classroom and approximately half of the practical beauty of the life we have. The commission in Wichita is not a threat to any of that. It is part of it." He looked at her with a fullness she had stopped trying to describe to herself because description always fell short of it. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "Go write them back and tell them yes." He went. She turned back to the letter to Thomas and Louise, and she wrote about the commission and about James, and about the autumn light on the prairie, and about the walnut writing desk she was sitting at, and the east window and the west window, and the way that the life she had was not the life she had come here expecting, but was more than she had known to hope for. She wrote about arriving at the hotel in Caldwell with road dust on her dress and wrong assumptions about what was waiting for her, and about the man in the lobby who had stood up when she came down the stairs in the polite, unhurried way of someone who was simply acknowledging her presence in the world. She had come to the frontier expecting hardship. She had found it, some of it enough to know she was capable of it. But she had found, woven through it and larger than it, something she had not come looking for and could not have described before she encountered it, which was a man who made the frontier feel like home. She sealed the letter and added it to the pile for the morning post. She went to check on James, who was sleeping with the complete unconscious commitment of a baby who has no remaining uncertainty about his position in the world, which was exactly the right position and entirely secure. She touched his cheek once with the back of her fingers and he made a small sound without waking. She went back to the bedroom and lay down and looked at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds of the Kansas night through the open window, the wind in the grass, something distant, an owl perhaps, the sound of the town settling into its late-night quiet. These were her sounds now. This was her dark. Frederick came to bed a while later, and she felt the familiar warmth of his presence, the particular adjustment of the world that happened when he was in the same room. "The letter is ready for the post," she said quietly, in case he was still awake. "Good," he said. "Thomas says Louise is already talking about visiting in the spring. I'll start the cradle," he said, "for if they stay. She's not pregnant yet to my knowledge. I'll make it for James when he's older then," he said, with the unflappable practicality of a carpenter. "Things I make tend to get used eventually." She laughed softly in the dark, and he pulled her closer and she lay there with his arm around her, and the prairie night outside and James asleep in his cradle, and the life she had built around her like a house that fit. And she thought that this was what the frontier had been, finally, underneath all the hardship and the dust and the drama and the unexpected love of it. It had been space. It had been the largest open space she had ever been inside, and in all of that space she had found out what she was made of, and she had found the one person whose particular shape made sense beside hers. And she had been brave enough when the moment came to call the if unnecessary. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything. The spring that Thomas and Louise visited was a green and golden one, the kind of spring that made the whole impossible decision to come west feel like something obvious in retrospect. They arrived together on the stage from Wichita, Thomas with his Colorado sun-darkening and Louise with her schoolteacher's composure, and an expression when she met Esther that moved quickly into the specific warmth of women who recognize each other as the same kind of person. James was 9 months old by this visit, no longer in the basket but thoroughly mobile in the alarming way of babies who have discovered that the world extends beyond the place where you were set down. And Louise sat on the kitchen floor with him for an entire afternoon, with the expression of a woman who was completing a certain kind of internal arithmetic about her own future. Thomas pulled Frederick aside at some point during the visit and had a private conversation that Esther was not party to, but the outcome of which she deduced from the way both men came back to the kitchen with the slight self-consciousness of people who have said something real to each other. She asked Frederick about it that evening. "He told me to take care of you," Frederick said. "I can take care of myself," she said. "I know," Frederick said. "I told him that." "He said he knew that too and was asking me anyway." He paused. "I told him I intended to." She looked at her husband, at the honest planes of his face in the lamplight, at the good hands that had built her a writing desk and laid in winter wood, and held her in the livery stable, and caught their son approximately 47 times as he practiced standing against the furniture with more ambition than balance. She thought about Marsh's gun and the school committee and the letter to the county and the walks by the creek and the morning light in the church. She thought about the hotel lobby and the remark about the name and the specific silence of a man who had told her something uncomfortable because she deserved to know it. She thought about how she had arrived in this town as a woman who had been treated as a piece in someone else's game and had chosen, with Frederick's support and her own considerable stubbornness, to become instead the main player in her own. "Good answer," she said. The years that followed were the years of a life well built, because that was the only kind of life that Frederick Cooper knew how to be part of, and Esther Hurst, who had become Esther Cooper in the morning light of the Caldwell Presbyterian Church, had discovered that she was the same kind of person. James was joined by a sister, Sarah, 2 years later, and Sarah was joined by another brother, William, 3 years after that, and the house expanded to hold them all, Frederick adding 2 rooms with the same care he had given the original 3, and the children grew up in the sound of a schoolroom and the smell of a carpenter's workshop, which turned out to be an excellent combination for producing people who could both think clearly and make something with their hands. Esther taught until her 3rd pregnancy made the logistics complicated, and then returned to it the following year, because the town needed her too and because she needed to. Because teaching was not something she did for circumstances but something she was, and the school grew with the town, eventually requiring a second teacher whom she hired with great care, and helped settle into Caldwell with all the practical knowledge she had accumulated about arriving somewhere new and making it yours. Thomas and Louise moved to Kansas eventually, not to Caldwell but to a town 30 miles north, where Louise had been offered a teaching position, and the families saw each other regularly across the moderate distance, which was the right amount of family proximity for adults who loved each other, close enough to be genuinely present in each other's lives and far enough apart to have their own. Caldwell itself changed over the years, as cattle towns changed when the railhead moved and the drives shifted their routes, and the temporary wild energy of the early trail years settled into something more permanent and considered. The saloons became fewer. The families who had come to Homestead stayed and built, and their children grew up as Esther's students. The town took on the particular character of a place that had decided to be permanent. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, Frederick came home from the shop early, which was unusual for him, and she was in the kitchen with James and Sarah, James practicing the reading that he had approached with his father's particular methodical thoroughness, Sarah drawing something elaborate and entirely her own on a piece of paper at the table. He came in and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of them, the children and the supper on the stove and the lamp lit and the evening light coming through the west-facing window, and she looked at him looking at it and felt the particular quality of that gaze, the same quality she had been watching for 5 years, the one that was full and honest and without residue. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, still looking. "I just came home a bit early." The shop was quiet. "I wanted to be here," he said simply. James looked up from his reading. "Papa, I finished the chapter." "Which chapter?" "The one with the river crossing," James pointed. "Mama said the boy and it was brave." "What do you think?" Frederick asked. James considered this with the solemnity he applied to things he thought were genuinely worth thinking about. "I think he was scared and did it anyway," he said. "Mama says that's what brave is." Frederick looked at Esther, and she looked back at him, across the kitchen, across 5 years and 3 children and 1 gun and 1 very good letter and 1 chalk tray and 1 evening on the creek road with the stars coming out, and across all of it what was visible in his face was simple and entire and permanent. "Your mother," he said to James, "is right about most things." "I know," said James, and went back to his book. Sarah kept drawing. The supper kept warming. The evening light came through the west window and did what it always did, turned everything it touched into something that was better than ordinary light could see. And Esther Cooper stood in her kitchen in Caldwell, Kansas, in the middle of her life, and understood completely that hardship was only part of the story, and that the other part, the one she had not expected, was this house, these children. This man in the doorway, who had stood up when she came down the stairs because she was worth standing for, and had told her difficult truths when they were necessary, and held her hand in the summer evening, and taken her son in his carpenter's hands with the same care he gave to everything he made. The frontier had been exactly what she'd expected, harsh and enormous and indifferent to individual comfort. But she had not been alone in it. She had not been managed or moved or made small. She had been, in the best and fullest sense of the word, free, and in that freedom she had chosen this, and this was the thing that had made the hardship into something else entirely. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him once in front of the children, who made the noises children make about such things, and then she handed him a cloth for the supper pot and told him supper was in 10 minutes. He took the cloth. He was smiling. He was still smiling when they sat down together at the kitchen table he had built, all 5 of them, with the lamp between them and the night coming in over the prairie and the west window, holding the last of the day's light for as long as it possibly could.